All right, so let me try to give you some basic understanding of theory. And again, I don't want to lose you here thinking that the whole semester is going to be filled with a lot of highfalutin political theory. It's not. But again, if you want to understand the Declaration of Independence and the nature of what it is, particularly, you're going to see something here. And then I'm going to show you in one of my favorite movies, National Treasure, The Book of Secrets. Love this one. Wouldn't that be great if we actually had a Book of Secrets and that Obama spends his evenings sort of flipping through the Book of Secrets? Wouldn't that be awesome? I'm going to show you a clip out of here that how many of you seen this movie? Probably most of us? Okay. Oh, man. Oh, this is awesome. This combines history and adventure. I mean, it's got me from the start. There's a scene in here that you could watch 100 times and it goes whoop, right over your head. In fact, it's one of those things where you watch in a movie and you're like, what in the world did that get included for? The reason it got included is because somebody who wrote the script for this knew a little something about what we're going to talk about this morning, and you'll see it. And as I may have said last week, the real purpose of your education, don't tell your parents this is being filmed, is not to get a diploma or gain skills, but the real purpose of your education is so that you can make interesting comments about movies. That's really the purpose of your education, so that when you're watching movies with people, you get control of that pause button and you hit the pause button at key times and give lectures. That's what you want to do. And so this will be it. So next time you're watching National Treasure with a group of people, you're going to be poised, just ready to get on that button, so that when you see this scene again, you'll hit pause and you'll give a lecture on political philosophy. And of course, you'll have to dodge popcorn and milk duds and things like that, but it'll be a fascinating experience for you. Okay, so let's do a little political theory. Again, I apologize for the PowerPoints. If you can't read them, I'll try to give you some sense. Ancient political philosophers and modern. Political philosophers differed on numerous key points about the nature of man and how men were supposed to live in collective society. And we'll be looking at 5 key areas of difference. Again, is that even legible in the back? Can you guys sort of make that out? Sort of? Huh? I will post these slides online for you. I generally don't want to post slides because I don't want you to get the impression that you just sort of jot down a few things on a slide and that's sufficient for your notes. I've tried to formulate slides here to keep you going on a conversation where we're headed with some things, but they're meant to just be sort of like breadcrumbs on a trail. You'll want a lot more in your notes in this regard. So, okay. So we're going to be looking at 5 major areas of difference between ancient political thought and modern political thought. Again, with the goal of helping you see that our framers, the people who put together this document, and our founders who put together the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation, those people had what you're about to be exposed to in mind and made some choices. And they chose more modernist theoretical ideas. Okay, so here are the first of our 5 major areas. Well, this is just to impress you that you might know a few names. This says ancients, and you see Plato and Aristotle. So as we do the comparison and you want to attach some names to it in your mind, Plato and Aristotle, the guys who wore bed sheets and did interesting things back in Athens, Greece, those are generally known as the ancient political philosophers. The moderns are Machiavelli, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. Those are sort of the biggest of the biggies. Again, so if you're interested in that kind of class in the future, those who you'd be reading. John Locke is a name you may have heard at some point because he's probably the most influential political philosopher in the American system of government. Just out of chance, has anybody read something like Plato's Republic? Fair, yeah, okay. And has anybody read any of these guys in a little modern political? Yeah, what have you read? You read Machiavelli, you read The Prince, and nasty. So my modern class yesterday, we're just starting to get into The Prince, which is his biggest political work, Machiavelli. And it's really an interesting, fun read to start the class with because when you read him, you're kind of thinking to yourself, is he really saying that? And I love to say, yeah, he's saying that. He thinks that a right political ruler should rule with a bold cruelty, doing whatever is necessary to found the right kind of regime. So if you have to be virtuous, be virtuous. If you have to be unvirtuous, be unvirtuous. That's what a wise ruler has to do. So, you know, obviously our framers didn't take sort of that into consideration when they drafted the document. They took more into account John Locke, particularly on his views on property and limited government, that kind of thing. Okay, so these are the players, but here are, as we work toward the 5, we're not there yet. Gosh, this is awful. This says ancient. For the ancients, and you'll see why this is their starting point here in a minute, the operative question that the ancient political philosophers asked is, what is the best form of government, or what's the best regime? Why did they ask that question? Because they thought that men by nature, just naturally, men were in political societies. They weren't radically individualistic kind of beings. They were naturally part of political societies. That if you found someone that you think is a man and he's not part of a political society, it's more likely you're confronting a god or some kind of beast, but it couldn't be human. That's how natural they thought it would be for us to live in political society. So that's why they would ask those questions. If it's natural for us to live together in political society, well, let's max out. What's the best regime? And so when you read, some of you guys have read Plato's Republic. If you recall, there's the pure and just city and all that glorious stuff that went along with that. Okay, the moderns, on the other hand, here at the bottom of this slide, ask, how can one man come to have legitimate power or control over another? Why did they think that was the starting point for political discussion? Because they think that men are naturally asocial, that by nature we aren't naturally drawn toward political society, that we by our natural state of affairs, and you'll come to understand this later today, is called the state of nature, are radically individualistic beings who have to be coaxed into civil society. And when we're coaxed into civil society, now the question becomes, well, how is it that one person comes to rule over me? Here's a good way of playing this out. What if, you know, as we try to get to know each other this semester, I said, well, let me tell you something about myself and my views on politics. I think that when you look at the history of our presidents, that those men, and someday those women, I think it's coming within the next, what do you think, ladies? When are we going to have a female president? I think it's going to be 8 years from now. What do you think? 16? Who's going to be our first female president? Could be Hillary. Hillary has morphed herself in the last 15 years from one of the most reviled women in the American political scene to one of the most admired politicians now. Her approval ratings are just off the charts, better than the president's, huh?
I think she'll go down in ratings.
Well, yeah, yeah, when you have to start having, you know, affecting public policy more as opposed to just sort of jet setting all over the world as Secretary of State, she might go down again. But anyway, well, we'll see. So maybe I just share with you here to start out that I hold the view that if you look at the 40 some odd presidents that we've had, the reason those men have been president is because they're superior human beings. That there's something about, say, our current president, Barack Obama, he's just better than you, and he's better than me. That's why he's the president. What do you think about that? You like that? No? Oh, you Americans bristling at such a concept, right? So you don't buy the idea in answering this question, how can one man come to have power of authority over me politically? You don't buy it because he's just a better person? No? There's something else. Does he have legitimacy? Does he have rightful authority in the American political order? And it isn't because he's just a superior human being? What might it be from? Yes.
People's choice, our choice.
Okay, so we chose him as a country. You may not have personally, but as a whole, we get to vote on it, right? What does voting entail? It entails being a part of a process that we've all consented to being a part of. Anybody heard the phrase consent of the governed? It's a very Lockean phrase. You also should have seen it in the Declaration of Independence. That's much more modern in its conception than what you'll see here. Okay, now I believe is where we get to the first of the five. Hallelujah, there they all are at once, and then we'll have an individual slide on each of them. So if I move too fast or you just simply cannot read them at this point, which is certainly understandable, let's work our way through. I can't even read this. It says 5 main points of difference between ancients and moderns. The first is man by nature individualistic or designed to live with others? Well, we sort of poked around with that already, but I'll add a little bit more to that. The second one is, how are we to understand man? By him in his perfection or just sort of the ordinary run-of-the-mill guy? You're going to see that the ancients and moderns answer these questions very differently. Again, don't get lost in the theoretical clouds. Just sort of see the main thread of what I'm trying to communicate to you here. The third one is, who or what should rule? Should wisdom rule or should passions rule? Fourth, is justice a natural kind of thing? Does justice exist and you try to order political society around it? Or is it just something we invent called a convention? So we'll see a little bit of that. And then lastly, where does good government come from? Does it come from good men, or could good governance come from bad men? Now, so those of you who've poked around in Aristotle or Plato's Republic, you'll see that the ancients came to some pretty interesting conclusions on this, that good governance could only come from good men. Perhaps you'll see a bit of a difference here when we start looking at the moderns here. Okay, so first point, is man by nature, oh, this is awful, isn't it? Is man social or political, or is he asocial or apolitical? So we've sort of already mentioned this, but let me say a little bit more. The ancients argued that men by nature are social beings. Aristotle, in his famous book called The Politics, said that men are by nature social or political animals. That you would find that you're more likely to find a beast or a god, but not a human being outside political society. So that's their starting point. If it's natural to men, you want to max out, and therefore the question is, what's the best form of regime to govern us in our natural state of being together? The moderns say that's a bunch of hooey, and they argue that men by nature are radically individualistic, that we are not naturally in civil society, and that in some sense we have to be coaxed, or we have to see that life is so bad, living as individualistic, isolated beings, that civil society is sort of the only solution for that. Believe it or not, our founders take more of this perspective than this perspective. And you'll see it in the Declaration of Independence here in a bit. Okay? The moderns are going to argue, and you'll see this label here in a bit. They argue that this state in which men live apart from each other as isolated beings, they call it the state of nature. That's the state in which men live in this pre-political condition in which we're all living as isolated beings. Rousseau thinks we're like indolent, lazy beasts who hang out in trees all day, and we stir ourselves from our slumber only to satisfy natural wants of eating and sex and things like that. That's what Rousseau thought. Hobbes thinks that the state of nature is a state of war in which you live in a 24/7 fear of violent death. It's like you can't even go to sleep because you know that if you go off to sleep, that means certain death. And he calls the state of nature cold, solitary, nasty, brutish, and short. That's the life of man in that pre-political existence. So boy, you got to get out of that one quick. So that's Hobbes. Locke has a little more generous view of the state of nature where men actually don't kill each other initially and that we can actually gain property and this kind of thing. So, okay, so that's the first of the five. The second is a general outlook of man. Is it teleological or non-teleological? Now, has anybody encountered this concept of telos? Is that a phrase that anybody is familiar with? Sorry?
Does it mean word?
Are you taking a logos? Okay. No, it's fine. This is a concept that you'll want to sort of put in your back pocket because you will encounter it in a variety of different settings. There is something called the teleological argument for God's existence. There's teleological ethical systems, and they all utilize this concept, which I'm now going to introduce to you. The notion of telos means end or design or a purpose for something. Okay? So when, say you're making an argument for God's existence and you use this concept, it goes like this, that the universe seems to demonstrate an end or design or purpose to it, therefore there is a designer. Well, that's philosophy class. If you're interested, Philosophy 214 today at 4:30, Sutherland 116, okay? For our purposes, we're utilizing this term telos, end, to connote the idea of an end state of perfection. So the ancients said if you want to understand man, you look to him in his state of completeness, his telos, and that's in civil society. So if you want to understand the nature of the being man, you look at him as a political animal operating in a political society. As you might guess, the moderns argued that there's no such thing as telos. Why? Because men aren't aiming at anything. They just are. They're just radically individualistic beings who just sort of go about their own existences with not a care in the world for anybody else. And if you want to understand man, that's how you have to understand him. Okay, now that's a little high theoretical stuff, but stay with me here. This is all going to sort of come together here in a bit. Any questions about the first two? I'm just sort of laying the table out here for you. And hopefully these documents, particularly the Declaration of Independence, will leap off the page at you in a way that it never has before. That's the goal. All right, so let's look at the third illegible slide. This one says, should wisdom rule or should the passions rule? Now, for those of you who've read Aristotle's Politics, or particularly notable is Plato's Republic, who rules there? Do you recall? Who provides leadership of a political society in Plato's Republic? Any recollections of this? The philosopher. That's why that was my sole goal for doing a graduate degree in philosophy 20 years ago, was so that I could maybe be a philosopher king and lead a political society someday. I've fallen short of that goal miserably. But if Plato's right, those who are most wise amongst us should provide political leadership to us. So when you read in the Republic where Plato advocates that these are the rare golden-souled individuals who lead, and they have rightful leadership over the rest of us because they're better people than you and I are. The philosopher king in Plato's Republic has a golden soul. There's something innate about him, sorry ladies, him, that makes him our rightful ruler. And political justice in that kind of society means that you submit to him. That's political justice. You shouldn't pretend to want to rule or even try to rule because you don't have that kind of innate golden soul. you got a bronze soul. You're just sort of a run-of-the-mill like the rest of us, okay? You don't like that, do you? The reason you don't like that is because we don't think about our political leaders having that sort of sense. I mean, if Barack Obama stood at a podium today and said something to the effect of, submit to me because I have a golden soul and I'm a superior person to you, you know, even if you were a supporter of the president and his policies, you'd be like, hey, buddy, who do you think you are? Well, that gives you some indication that we haven't bought into the ancient way of sort of thinking about political leadership. We're more down in here, that we believe that though we hope wisdom should rule, we take a more realistic view, and we think that the passions should rule. Let me give you a snippet of something you're going to read later in the semester. You're going to read from one of the very famous Federalist papers called Federalist 51. And think about this. This says the moderns believe that the passions should rule, most notably the desire for self-preservation. The moderns may have taken an arguably more biblical view, not that they were quoting chapter and verse on these kinds of things, but it's arguably the case that when you start to look at particularly our founding documents and when you start to look at modern political philosophy, there's more of an alignment with a biblical view of the nature of man as maybe being depraved than sort of a pie in the sky, or what was perceived to be pie in the sky, ancient ways of thinking. So you'll read this later in the semester. It's out of Federalist 51. He says here, James Madison says, ambition must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. It may be a sad reflection on human nature that such devices are necessary. But what is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, then neither external or internal controls on government would be necessary. But in framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this, that you must first enable the government to control itself, and in the next place, control the governed. I mean, that's pretty realistic, right? You've got ambitious men who are going to be in government, and so you've got to design a system of government to take into account those kind of men. Ambitious, greedy, potentially. And so the moderns said, wisdom, who cares about that? You design institutions that will harness men's passions. Ever heard of the separation of powers? That was our way of addressing ambitious men that might fill these offices, is that you create separate branches of government that will compete against them, and we design a self-policing system because these would be ambitious people seeking their own glory and power, and you got to control them. You've got to suitably empower them so that they can control us, but they can't get out of control themselves. How do you do that? Well, you design institutions. The ancients would have said, you don't need any of that stuff because you've got a golden-souled person sort of wandering around, leading us by his great wisdom, leading us to the promised land of the pure and just city. Okay, moving on. This says, is justice natural or is it invented? Now think abstractly for me here for a second, right? If the ancient view's correct, then justice exists apart from any political community. And the goal of a political community would be to get your political community in line with it. Justice exists naturally. That's what the ancient view was. The modern view says that justice is just a convention or invention. You know what justice is, says Machiavelli? Here's what justice is. When you get together and form political societies and you put the biggest guy in charge of you, what he tells you to do, you do, and you're acting justly. Such is the origin of justice. How about that? In Plato's Republic, which was a rejected notion of justice, one of the offerings there was a guy named Thrasymachus, if you remember this, and he said, you know what justice is? It's just the advantage of the stronger. Whoever carries the biggest stick in the most powerful way, when you do what he says, you're being just. Justice doesn't exist naturally. It just follows by sort of being law-abiding. Hobbes talks about justice being doing whatever the sovereign tells you to do, that kind of thing. Okay, so you see quite a difference on this particular question. Now we're getting to the end and going to tie all this together. Where does good government come from? Well, we've already got a glimpse of this already, but this is sort of starting to tie it together. For the ancients, good government could only come from good or just men who were leading us to a promised land of a certain sort. For Plato, it was the pure just city. For Aristotle, it was the best regime. And so they favored things like almost monarchical type settings. They didn't think much of democracy. For the moderns, good or just government can even come from bad men. It has been said, and think about this as we go forward this semester, so I'll say this twice. It's been said that the American system of government was designed in such a way that it hoped for men on their best days, but expected them on their worst. So it's a system of government that's been designed hoping that you would get virtuous action from men, but expecting not. So how do you do that? You have to design a system of government to harness and control potentially bad men, where even those ambitious, greedy, nasty men can be used in a political governance towards good ends. And they thought that they had designed such a system of government. Okay, is that the fifth one? It is. So now we're in a position to try to understand the Declaration of Independence and point back to some things here. So let's see what this slide, oh, this is awful, right? Let's see if I can play with this to get it to show for just a second. Oh, right quickly. Oh, look at that. It's actually legible. These are the folks that we're going to be talking about now, the moderns. They're called social contract theorists. And you can't understand the Declaration of Independence unless you understand this little schema. That's why I'm getting rather tired holding this. Oh, please, Lord. There, oh, this is lovely. Now, who cares about Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, right? That's, I mean, in terms of making you memorize names or stuff like that. I'm just putting those on there just so you've got touch points. The most important point here is that you see this little schema here at the bottom. Stay. Oh, that is lovely. I'm not anticipating that staying long, so. All right. So let's look at each of these individual pieces and see a process here. I'll just say this at the beginning, and this will make some sense, but it'll make more sense as we go forward. We've already talked about this state of nature. This is the state. This is the modern understanding of men in their natural state. We all live as isolated individuals, in which it can be a nasty state of war, if you think Hobbes was right. It can be sort of a pleasant, wonderful little place where we all just sort of hang out in trees all day, if you believe Rousseau. But the state of nature is the state in which men live as isolated beings, and that certain things start to happen that cause us to move towards civil society. And the manner in which we move towards civil society is called a social contract. Don't get the idea of a piece of paper on a table and we're all line up and put our John Hancocks on there. It's an implicit agreement to live within a political society and live within the bounds and authority of the government underneath it. That's called a social contract. It's not a piece of paper, it's an implicit agreement. And the understanding of our founders was that we, as colonists, participated in the British social contract. And the British social contract, like all social contracts, does two things. And I think I have a slide on this that would be fairly important for you to see. Yes? So let's jury. There. This is really bad, berries. If it's not bad enough, we're in the worst classroom on campus. They give us defective devices here. This is wholly terrible. Okay. A social contract, and this is all of this coming together for you now. All this political theory that I can tell. Every semester I run through this for an hour and people are like, I'm dropping this class right now. Because if this is the rest of the semester, I have no idea what this guy's talking about. This is for a purpose. A social contract does two things. Oh, are we off again? This is almost insufferable. Ooh. Yeah, we're going to work on that in the break here. We're almost done, and I'll jury rig this at the break. Did you not get enough of that slide? All right, back to this again. Tell me when you got it. Some slides are just so key, you got to have it. I wonder if I can shove the Federalist Papers next to it. Maybe. Okay. All right. Let's say that we wanted to form a social contract now in this class, what would it do? It would forever bind us as a people, and it's eternal. We would be forever brethren of this political order. Once we have established that political order, the next step would be to establish or form political bonds. And that phrase may look familiar to you from the Declaration of Independence. Those are the two things that happen in a social contract. What's a social contract? It is the mechanism that you move from the state of nature, where you live as isolated individuals, to a civil society. The American colonists would have seen themselves as part of the British social contract, in which they were forever bonded to their brethren across the ocean as British. Even after the Revolution, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, all these big wigs, right, would have considered themselves British, even after the Revolution. Why? Because that's forever. This isn't. When you establish yourself as a people, you form a government, but when that form of government that you put over you is no longer directed toward what was originally established, you can revolt from it. You can disassociate yourself not from these people, but from the political bonds that would have been over you. Is that starting to bring the Declaration of Independence alive a little bit for you? So let me read to you the Declaration of Independence if you have it in front of you. I'm just starting right here at the beginning. And see if you see a little social contract theory here in this document. When in the course of human events, sorry, I see you're still getting it out. Ready? Okay, if you don't have it in front of you, just listen, but as a general rule, bring in what you've read for the week into class, because we'll be referencing it. We'll reference key elements of our textbook. We'll reference certainly things that we read outside our textbook, and so we'll be able to interact with those kinds of things. All right, Declaration of Independence. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for what? One people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with one another. That is straight out of Locke's social contract theory. You see that? The announcement of the Declaration of Independence was that for whatever reason, we're not there yet, while we remain one people with the British, we are now dissolving the political bands with them. Think British government, King George and all that stuff, right? Parliament, blah, blah, blah. So why, from your reading of this, I'd like to hear from you, why from your reading of the Declaration of Independence over the past week were we going to dissolve the political bands with the British government?
I felt they were no longer being treated like British citizens should be treated.
Yeah, what would give you indication of that?
They're being taxed without representation.
Okay, yeah.
Would be one.
Wouldn't it be glorious if there was a list of grievances that we had against the British sort of sovereign, the British government? Wouldn't it be great that if, I don't know, I'm not aware of it, maybe you are, maybe there's a historical document that you might make me aware of in which there's a list of grievances, specific grievances that we may have had against the British government in which we would announce that we're dissolving the political bands. Are you aware of such a document? Oh, it's unbelievable. Unbelievable. Here we go. Look at the back half of the Declaration of Independence and you see a list of these things. How do I know it's a list? Look here at the bottom. It says, where's a good place to start here? Oh, here's the famous phrase, right? But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it's their right, it's their duty to throw off such a government and to provide new guards for their future liberty. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Britain as a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of a tyranny, remember that word, tyranny, over the states. To prove this, here's a list. Now some of these are sort of lost on us, right? Because we're not ruled by King George anymore, and this would have been, but the American colonists would have read this and go, yeah, every one of those he's guilty of. What's he guilty of? He is guilty not of a few screw-ups. He's guilty of a long and repeated train of usurpations and all this nasty stuff, right? And if you missed it, here's the laundry list that they give for us. And that's the announcement that the legitimacy that King George and the British government had over us is no longer legitimate, and we have a right of revolution. You know what plagiarism is? Yeah? This is a plagiarized document from Locke's second treatise on government. If I had Locke's second treatise on me, I could read to you excerpts from it and you're going, holy cow, that's like the same thing that Jefferson had here. Well, for a purpose. They understood Locke's theory on revolution and drafted a document based upon it, based upon an understanding of modernist, social contract theory. That's why I walked through all that stuff, right? Now, is there any question about that before we sort of bow tie this and take a break? Do you see the method to the madness now, why I walked through a little ancient and political thought? Our framers understood a modernist system of government essentially under a social contract theory governed by, and this is even in the document here, right, a consent of the governed. Where is it? Here it is. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Locke says pursuit of property. So there's a little bit of a change. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So governments have just powers over us because we have consented to their legitimacy or consented to a certain process. That's what we do, right? That's what we do. Later in the semester, you're going to get a chance to read Lincoln giving a lecture to the Southerners who are picking up guns and cannons and getting ready to start the Civil War. and he's going to remind them of these very same kinds of things. That there is legitimacy. I'm legitimate, he says, is because I'm the victor of a process that we've all submitted to. If you don't submit to it, we no longer have the rule of law, we have anarchy, is what he says. Yes?
So social contract, that's a question. So it's like it clearly says that the second one was dissolved, but when do we, like you said, they were still British?
Yeah, and we still are.
We still are?
Good news.
Not even doing that, okay.
We are forever bonded with the British people in a certain way. This way. So in that sense, we still share something with the British, with the people of Great Britain, that we share with no other country in the world, according to social contract theory. And it is really interesting. You'll see this very early on, even after the revolution, you'll see that there are still a large number of people. How stinking ironic is this? That even after the revolution, successful revolution, there's a large number of people who want to go to war on Britain's side against the French. Now, what do you know about the American Revolution regarding the French? They helped us. That's how strong that bond would have been seen by the early Americans, is that we're one with the British people, and so if they're in a war not against us but with the French, of course we would be on the British side. You're going to get to read here in a couple weeks where there is this real live issue. Britain and France are in another one of their 100 wars they've been after each other. And we signed a peace treaty with France after the war and said, basically, you got our back, we got yours. Well, now they're on a fight with the British, and now the question is, are we going to make good on this treaty? Washington says, no, we're going to stay out of this. And it ensues a huge controversy, which you'll get a chance to read about. Why? Because I'm trying to make you history students and make you really interested in history? Yeah, a little bit. But what you're going to see is that the issue that came up in the 1790s is the same issue we're dealing with today. And that's really the point of this class, is to help you become more conversant in that. To help you see that the debates that we have in this country today are some of the same debates that we've been having for 200 some odd years. And it starts 3-4 years after this document is drafted. Okay. All right. Let's see. Is there anything of note here? Yes. All right. So let's make sure that we answered these questions, and then we'll take a break. First question, or first observation, is that when you look at the Declaration of Independence, you need to understand it from that modernist framework. It didn't assume that men were naturally political animals. It didn't assume that men were unequal. There's no golden-souled people walking around who are our rightful political leaders. We have to base a system of government based upon the consent of the governed, because when we start asking the question like, well, why should Mr. Frampton rule over me? He's no better than I am. Answer, because I've consented to a certain political process of which he won, and therefore he has legitimacy. And he will continue to have legitimacy as long as he governs for the purposes for which government was instituted. That sound familiar? I mean, if the next guy running for president says that you ought to elect me because I have a golden soul, in America, he would go about 10 minutes, right? I mean, it didn't matter how good looking he is and what a study is and what his political track record is. There's something quintessentially rejecting in America about a guy purporting himself to be better than me, right? It just doesn't work here because we've bought into this kind of conception of things. By the way, friends, you may not be aware of two things. We are in high holy political season right now. I don't know if you've been following any of that. If not, I'm going to force you to a little bit this semester. The other thing is that there is a reasonable likelihood that one of us, a Biolan, may, in 4 years, be running for the presidency of the United States. Does that get your interest in American politics? Who am I speaking of? Oh, you might get to know the name John Thune, T-H-U-N-E, a 1983 graduate of Biola University, who is the second leading Republican in the United States Senate from the state of South Carolina. And he came this close to running for the presidency this time around. He's got the look, ladies. He's got the hair. He's got the swag. You know, he's got it all. He's got it all. Yeah? So look for it. I mean, if John Thune runs for the presidency in 2016, the press is going to be all over this campus. My guess is they're going to try to make you look like your students at Bob Jones. They're going to try to make Biola look like, you know, Bob Jones. They're going to be interviewing you, and they're going to say things like, "You really sign a contract? Well, what's up with that? I mean, are you in the dark ages? What's going on?" They're going to try to portray us in this regard. So I'm assuming that if that happens, some folks in Metzger are going to be thinking about, you know, certain parameters and boundaries that the national press, as they would descend upon this university if he was ever sort of a serious contender for the Republican nomination. So we'll see. Okay. Obviously, we see the list. They were upset. And the document announces, so to end our time here, the document announces that we are dissolving the political bands that was established in the original social contract with the British people. I mean, that's really what the Declaration of Independence is. So I hope in an hour or so here that I have given you some kind of understanding of the Declaration that you may not have possessed before. And you could have read the Declaration over the past week and seen this list of grievances and not understood why we would be announcing this to the world. We were announcing to the world that legitimacy has been lost, and therefore we were justified in revolting. That's really what this document is all about. Okay. All right, so here's what I want to do in the last half of class. We may not go the whole time today, so we'll see. But what I want to do is now add to your understanding of our founding documents and the Constitution and give you a primer of where you're going to be going in your reading for next week. And the purpose for what you're going to be doing in the weeks to follow here is get an understanding of the American founding, how the system of government was supposed to be set up, so that you'll have a point of comparison as a 21st century American or interested foreign national, so as a point of comparison to see what's going on today, so that you'll understand the debates that happen in this country better. And then you'll have a point of reference so that when some politician stands before you at some point on TV or in person and says the American founders blah, 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 that you'll have a point of comparison to say that guy has no idea what he's talking about. Or he actually has an idea what he's talking about. Now here's an example of that. I'm driving to school not too long ago, and I heard one of those talking heads on the radio say something like this. Well, President Obama is the worst thing since sliced bread because he did something today that he shouldn't have done because the Constitution explicitly gives the president power in certain ways, and I don't see where the Constitution gives President Obama this ability to do this in so many words, and so he's acting unconstitutionally. Really? Well, if you know something about the Constitution and the manner in which it's written, particularly Article 2 of the Constitution, you'll see that this guy has no idea what he's talking about. Why do I tell you that? Because we'll give you some categories of thought here in this class as you think about the constitutional order, where you'll be able to make better assessments of those kinds of things. And presidents particularly push the envelope on some things, and you'll want to have some kind of category of thought to where you see whether these men are acting constitutionally or not, and you'll actually be able to weigh in on that in a little more intelligent manner. On Blackboard, when I give you reading on Blackboard, I put discussion type questions, things to look for as you read these documents, so that you're not just reading passively, that you can read actively looking for the key ideas that we will use in this class. So as you'll notice, these are the kinds of issues that we talked about pertaining to the Declaration of Independence. The only one that we didn't particularly address is, in the Declaration of Independence, what did it appeal to as the ultimate grounding of our rights? Meaning, upon what basis do we have political rights in this country ultimately according to the Declaration of Independence? Any insight into that after reading it? What ultimately, do governments give us our right, or is there something more foundational? What is it?
I mean, it says that endowed by the Creator of certain unalienable
Yeah.
full rights.
Yeah. Now, we'll talk a little bit here this semester about religion and the American political order, enough to where, particularly given our situation here at Biola, where we have religious commitments, it's important for us to start to see the role that religion has played in the American constitutional order, what role it continues to play. To date, we have never had a president of the United States who has said, elect me even though I'm an atheist. Now, I think it's coming, but to date, we sort of haven't had this kind of person. So we still give lip service, at least, to religion of a certain sort and this kind of thing. You know, the big debate now is Obama a Muslim? Well, if he was even thought to be a Muslim 20 years ago, he would have been unelectable. A lot of people go, well, if he's a Muslim now, that doesn't disqualify him, but I'm not crazy about the idea. 10 years from now, it won't make any difference. It's sort of the direction we're headed. I don't think he's a Muslim, but you know, there's a lot of people sort of think that he is. Okay, so the Declaration of Independence appealed to something outside the governmental system, nature and nature's God. We're endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights that no government can strip you from. So no matter what the government does, you can't be stripped of certain rights that are grounded in a transcendent religious realm, says our document. Very different than other constitutions across, you know, the world and history. So that's an important fact that you'll want to do. And then the whole purpose of our time, you know, last hour was to help you see, in light of this question, whether the document represents a more of a modern or ancient perspective. It represents more of a modernist conception, social contracts and all that stuff. Okay, we're going to move away now from the Declaration specifically, unless you have any questions about that. Okay. All right. So let me give you a little history here, just to make sure you sort of see the bouncing ball here a little bit. If you're a little rusty with American history, we declared independence from Great Britain in 1776. Have any of you been to Independence Hall and seen the place? Yeah? Fascinating. It's sort of like the high holy mecca of American political history is Independence Hall in downtown Philadelphia. If you've not been to this, it's a really almost eerie kind of place to be, because obviously Philadelphia now is a modern city with high-rises and all this stuff, but there's like a 3-block section of Philadelphia that they have preserved that looks like, or they tried to preserve these buildings as they would have looked like, you know, 200-300 years ago. And Independence Hall, where Nicolas Cage and the boys go in the first movie, is where they actually film those scenes. And there is one particular wing of Independence Hall where the Declaration of Independence was signed, and it's where the Constitution was debated and signed and all this stuff. And that is like, I mean, when you go there, for history political junkies like myself, you know, my palms start to get sweaty, and I'm really nervous because I'm in like Mecca here. You can see Ben Franklin's cane and Thomas Jefferson's hat and stuff like that. I mean, I sort of like that kind of stuff. So welcome to my world, right? But anyway, that's where that document was signed, and that was in 1776, the Declaration. Well, we fight a little war, right, with Great Britain, and it lasts for 5-6 years. And if you're interested in sort of seeing how that comes out, another great movie to watch is The Patriot. You know, there's a lot of far-fetched stuff going on in The Patriot, but essentially at the end of the American Revolution essentially ends at Yorktown. I mean, that is the last major military engagement, and that's where the French really come to our rescue with their fleet hemming in Cornwallis and his army there at Yorktown, and that whole scene. The ending scenes there of The Patriot, the movie with Mel Gibson, is just classic. Get a picture of what that might have looked like. Okay, that's around 1781. So now we get a chance to formulate our own system of government, and we do this with the Articles of Confederation. And I want to look at a few key phrases in here. I didn't want you to necessarily read it for detail, but let's see what we have here. I'll scroll up here a little bit, and we'll see what kind of progress we can make from some of these questions. So as we read the Articles of Confederation this week, I encouraged you not to get caught up in the details. Why? Because the document doesn't govern us anymore. I mean, it's not, I mean, unless you're just a history, political science freak like myself, who cares about the details of Article 1 of the Articles of Confederation? Now, I might say you might care about Article 1 of our governing document, and we will look at some of this in detail, and you'll come to understand this document in a pretty detailed form over the course of this semester. But as we looked at the Articles of Confederation, we were interested in sort of the big picture items here. So let me hear from you. Did you get a sense of these kinds of questions? How were the states supposed to work together under the Articles of Confederation? Any clue about that? Let me ask it this way to generate some comments from you. How do the states work together today? What is the relationship between California and Maryland today? Or California and Nevada, or whatever, right? What is the relationship between the 50 states of the Union today?
Aren't they all equal?
Okay, there's a sense of equality of a certain sort. Okay, yeah, ma'am?
We all have states' rights.
Okay, we all have states' rights of a certain sort.
We're all one country.
Ooh, very nice. Keep going.
And even though independent states have their different rules, essentially we all call to a higher power.
We are all operating, that's really nice. So all of these comments are good, but essentially what you take for granted today is that we sort of operate all under one umbrella today, don't we? I mean, if you go overseas and you run into a Bulgarian and he or she says to you, where are you from? It's likely you'll say from the United States of America. It's not likely, or less likely, that you would say, well, I'm a Californian, right? So there's a certain understanding of the nature of the gig now versus what it used to be. We sort of operate as a nation today. Do we have a national government? I like to ask these obvious, simple questions to sort of start us off with confidence, right? We do have a national government, don't we? Can it act independently of the states? I mean, if our Congress, you know, the House of Representatives and the Senate, passed a bill and the president signed it, make it into law, does he have to call the governor of North Dakota to make sure that's okay? So in other words, what you guys are telling me is that the federal government can act independently of the states. Not so under the Articles of Confederation, yes?
Wouldn't it be though the representatives of the state?
Sure.
So the states do have input on all the bills.
They're
directly.
and not so much the states as the people within it, right? Because we elect the people who go to Congress and we elect Obama. The state of California didn't sort of, in some collective sense, say Obama or John McCain. So okay, we're getting there. We're gonna add understanding to this. Okay, so under the Articles of Confederation, the states didn't necessarily work together in the same kind of way. This is the first point of consideration here, and I'll show you Article 1 of the document here to illustrate this for you. Tell me what you know about the United Nations. Know anything about the United Nations? Take a risk. Yes, ma'am.
Isn't it like a group of countries that are together, but they are much more independent?
Right.
They are their own countries,
Right.
but yet they are Great Britain.
Anybody been to the United Nations? On the east side of Manhattan, big fancy black building, bunch of flags out front. What do those flags represent? The different nations that would come there, right? And if we were to actually go inside the United Nations while all those people are yammering about whatever they're yammering about, who would we run into? Starts with an A. Ambassadors to these various countries. So let's see. We wander in the United Nations, and they're having a coffee break, and I run into the ambassador from the country of what's a good country to pick on? Lithuania. And I say, so, friend, what were you guys talking about today? Well, we were talking about this problem in Iran with them getting a nuclear device, and a bunch of people are all up in arms about that. Oh, so what did they decide? Well, they're just talking about it. And so after they're done talking about it, then what? Well, I'm going to go back to my president there in Lithuania, and I'm going to tell him what they talked about here. Are you, sir, are you obliged to tell your president that he has to act in a certain way? No. We're sort of our own little country. We can act as we want to act. Imagine the United States working like that. That's the Articles of Confederation. So look at Article 1 if you have a copy of it here. If not, I'll just read Article 1 of the Articles of Confederation to you. And you get the sense of this autonomy that each state had from one another. It was for the lack of a better term, a mutual cooperation pact. It wasn't a union. All right. So here's Article 1 of the Constitution, actually Article 2, sorry. Each state shall retain its sovereignty, its freedom and independence, and every power, jurisdiction, and right which is not by this Confederation expressly delegated to the United States in Congress assembled. That's a rather odd phrase. The United States in Congress assembled. So two things to gain from this. One is that each state acted like its own separate little sovereign country. That's key. And the other is that we really didn't have a nation, a whole, until the right people came together in the right room. Then we sort of had a nation. The United States in Congress assembled. It's sort of like saying you don't really have a United Nations until the right ambassadors fill certain seats. Then you have a United Nations. Right? When you think about the United Nations, you don't think about a one world country, do you? You think about a bunch of different countries who have ambassadors that are sent to New York to yammer about various and sundry issues. Is the United Nations an effective style of governance? Does a lot get done there? I mean, you may not know a lot about it, but its reputation for being a pretty, I'm thinking of a word, impotent, ineffectual type governance is accurate. It's not effectual because there's no movement, right? A bunch of people get together and talk about things, but then they all go back to their separate capitals and talk about it some more. And people who want to cause trouble in the world bank on that fact. They bank on it. All you have to do, like Syria, does anybody know what's going on in Syria today? Massive bloodshed. The people of Syria are sort of revolting against their very autocratic style of governance there. This Assad fella whose father ruled Syria for decades, and now he's ruling it with an iron fist. I mean, we're talking thousands of people are being slaughtered by tanks and artillery and things like that. Imagine the United States military being turned on us. So as you tried to protest against a certain style of governance in the United States, you'd have U.S. military personnel firing grenades at you and tank shells and things like that. That's what's happening in Syria today. And two countries are getting in the way of the United Nations doing something about it, or at least passing sort of some ordinance of some sort saying, you know, we really ought to do something about that. Two countries. Anyone take a guess at what those two countries are? Take a wild guess. They're big countries. No. China and Russia. Why would China and Russia get in the way of something so obvious? These people need help. They're being slaughtered by their own government and their own government's military. Well, because they got other sort of interest in China and Russia, and they do a lot of business there in Syria. So they're not going to punish the existing regime. All that to say, in a system of governance in which you sort of operate like separate entities in this mutual cooperation pact, it doesn't take much to sort of get in the way of things moving in a certain direction. And that is the history of the country from roughly 1783 to 1787. It's a period of time in which you'll come to know is the critical period. You're going to read about it next week. For next week's class, you're going to read a piece out of a book. You're just going to read one chapter, which is on Blackboard, out of a book called The Creation of the Presidency. It's the piece by Thatch. And just to make sure in context you know what you're reading, you're going to read about the nasties that were going on during this critical period. Bloodshed, violence, economic chaos, economic backstabbing from one state to another. I mean, if we're running our own little gig in Massachusetts, why should we cooperate with New York? In fact, we should develop economic policies in Massachusetts so that those New Yorkers suffer. That's a good way to run a country, isn't it? So as you read the Thatch piece, you're going to read some fun, gory details, but see it as a failure of the system of government. And there are some fundamental flaws in the system. And those two fundamental flaws are lack of energy, governmental energy to do anything, and a system that relied on the mutual cooperation. Now let's think about it. Let's not be too hard on the Articles of Confederation. Why would there be an assumption that these new states, former colonies, would cooperate with one another? Why would that not have been a ridiculous assumption?
Well, they were all kind of united under the idea that they didn't want to be ruled by Britain anymore.
And they did something about it, didn't they? What'd they do?
Well,
Obvious.
yeah, they
Yeah.
went to war against
They fought a war. Now look, if you've ever think about bonding with a group of people, if we want to bond as a class, I'm going to call up Professor Tanis and say, we're going to take your class on in a paintball war, right? And there's something that's going to happen in this class when I see Mr. Frampton has my back, I'm about to get shot, and he takes out the guy that's shooting me. Man, brother, yeah, there's a bonding. So if we were to form sort of a governmental entity, I'd go, yeah, of course I would cooperate with him. He had my back during the war. We fought, we blood, sweat, and tears, right? So the assumption of a mutual cooperation here under the Articles of Confederation wasn't an unreasonable one, it just didn't pan out. Things got so bad, guys, that none other than George Washington in his writings said, maybe we need to go back to the monarchy. That's how bad things got. They didn't want to go back to King George, so they thought, maybe we'll get some two-bit lord over there in Europe somewhere, and we'll bring him over here, and he'll be our king, and sort of reestablish order. That's how bad things got. That's why they met in Philadelphia in 1787, to give you another date, and they draft this, the Constitution of the United States, to correct the deficiencies of our first shot, our first Constitution called the Articles of Confederation. So without taking the time, and again, that's why I wanted you to sort of look for the big picture, as you flip through this document, you see a very different system of government. You start seeing things like quotas, that the government, we really don't even have a national government until the right people come into the right room. Many scholars don't even think we had a national government until the Constitution. Under the Articles of Confederation, we had 13 separate state governments and some kind of United Nations sort of weirdly hovering over what's going on. We didn't call it the United Nations, we called it the Confederation Congress. But it sort of operated like that. Now here's a term you're going to see throughout the semester. Abraham Lincoln will refer back to this, and you'll see it referred to as a compact of states theory. If I had any board space, I'd write it on the board. A compact of states theory. That's the kind of union, if you want to call it that we had under the Articles of Confederation. A loose association of states who retained their own sovereignty and operated independently of one another. We don't operate like that anymore, do we? We operate as a different kind of union. So what gives us a tip-off to that? Well, look at the preamble to the Constitution. We, the people of the United States, in order to form a more perfect union. Boy, the preamble makes a little more sense now, doesn't it? This is a corrective to the Articles of Confederation. This was meant to create a more perfect union. You had a chance to read Federalist 1 today, or for today, and one of the things that was argued in Federalist 1, or at least one of the things that was laid out, was, and you can get this from any kind of seriously written introduction to a book. When you read a book, it's always nice when the author sort of says, hey, here's where we're going. Well, the author of the Federalist Papers, in this case John Jay, in Federalist 1, lays out the topics that will be addressed in the book. And one of the first 10 essays, Federalist 1 through 10, fall under the title of the necessity of union for our political prosperity. That we need to create a whole different system, a whole different union, and that's going to lead to political prosperity. What you're going to get a chance to read in for next week in that Thatch piece, that Thatch chapter in that book, The Creation of the Presidency or something like that, talks about the ugliness of that 7-year period of time called the critical period. One last attempt to demonstrate the difference between the kind of union we have today versus the kind of union we had under the Articles of Confederation. Little known fact about yours truly is that I am the Reverend Doctor. I actually could marry you if you wanted to. Not myself, I'm already married and polygamy is illegal here. But I could actually officiate a service in marrying you. Now, how many of you who may be seriously dating someone or dream someday of seriously dating someone — I had to get married to get a date, by the way. Anyway, that's just my personal issue. How many of you would want me to marry you if I gave you the following marital advice? So you bring in your big stud ladies or your dear lady men to my office and you say, hey, we're looking for a pastor to marry us here next June. Would you be so interested? Absolutely. I've got the whole June free. I'm not teaching any classes. I'd be glad to marry you. Let me tell you what marriage is all about. Marriage is really no big deal. We're going to have this ceremony in June, but afterwards, nothing really fundamentally has changed about you. You're still your own woman. You're still your own guy. If you guys want to cooperate, fine. If not, fine. I'm assuming you will because, you're sort of showing up in June to do it. And by the way, if things ever get bad, leave. No big deal. You just, there's nothing significant that's going to happen in June. It's going to be a little ornate ceremony, and we're going to eat some nice food afterwards and sort of throw a party. Anybody want me to marry him? That's the kind of union we had under the Articles of Confederation, a loose association between two separate entities. You might be more interested in me marrying you if I started to open up the book of Genesis and start talking about something fundamental that might change in that Saturday in June, right? That as you enter into this marital relationship, now something's fundamentally changed about you and your former fiance, now spouse, and that you are forever bound to that person, that there is a perpetual bond, that not the two becoming one flesh. Is this sounding a little better to your ears? Now I think the line's forming outside the door ready for me to marry him, right? That's the nature of the union under the Constitution. And this Abraham Lincoln will remind the Southerners of in 1860. So when you get a chance here in a couple months to read some Abraham Lincoln, he's going to refer back and say, hey guys, we tried it your way under the Articles of Confederation. We formed a different kind of union under the Constitution, and you can't leave. And essentially what he was telling the Southerners in my marriage analogy is, friends, divorce is not an option. We got to work this out because of the nature of the union we have. And so you'll see that. Okay, so now I think we're in a position. Is there anything else I want to say about the Articles? Not really. Okay. Any comments about the Articles of Confederation? We'll reference back to them, but only as sort of a miserable failure. Miserable, right? All right, now the Constitution. Let's talk a little bit about that. This does govern us. We are interested in the detail of this. Tell me, now be honest, how many of you've never read the Constitution cover to cover until this past week? Good, I like it. To be honest, I'm going to come give you a hug. It's a cathartic experience to admit it. This document governs you, but you've maybe never read it cover to cover. How long did it take you? You know, not too long. You know, I could sort of do this before breakfast, you know, just sort of peruse it pretty carefully, yeah? It tells you something about the document that I can do this to it, doesn't it? I mean, you can learn a lot about a constitution simply by watching me do this. What does it tell you? It's light. I like to ask the obvious questions, right? It's light. I can hold it in 2 fingers. If I had enough sticky on 1 finger, it would stick, right? How about this document? What if last week's assignment was to read the Constitution, and I said there's 1 copy of it at the library, and it's this? What does that tell you about the document? You don't want to read it, right? But what does it tell you about the difference between this is a written constitution versus this? Hello? The font has been minimized. So maybe there's as many words here in this as there are here, but we've got 10-point font and 20-point font in here. Maybe, probably not. There's no fluff.
There's no words that don't need to be said.
In here?
In
Okay, so this is wordy. Here's a
wordy. There's more explanation for stuff that would be on.
let's explore that last part. Yeah? Additional, so there might be more in here than here? What kind of more stuff?
There's no room for adoption as like we progress.
On which one? This. There's no room for adaptation. Couldn't I just add more pages? I'm going to play the devil's advocate.
Well, yeah, but it's probably got a lot more explained in it.
Oh, now we're getting there. All right, now. Yeah, this is more detailed, right? So when we sit down and try to write a constitution like this, does it take longer maybe than this? Why? Let's talk about this one first. What kind of detail, and I'm getting tired holding this, right? What kind of detail is in here that's not in here?
There's a lot of things that are assumed in here, of understanding.
In here.
Yeah. So if you were to go and dive deeper into those assumptions, you'd have to just go into description about all those different things.
Okay.
Because all these people are coming from a background and all understand each other in certain respects.
Okay. Possibly, yeah.
It's the distilled version of it. So like you said, you don't have that background, but it keeps the essential bits that you want.
So this is just the essentials and this is the detail?
Yes.
Sort of something like that? Now what happens when you have to really govern yourselves and you get circumstances that come up that aren't specifically addressed in this? What do you do?
Interpret it.
Ooh, oh yeah. All right, now you're into the game of the Constitution and constitutional law. You gotta interpret it, and that's a fun little game that we'll see gets played very early on. Now, if something specific comes up and this is your Constitution, it's much more likely you go, oh yes. We considered that option, and here it is in section 952, paragraph 3. There it is. This is a document written like this to try to take into account all specific contingencies that you might encounter, right? Not so here. You can learn a lot about this document simply by this. The manner in which it was written. They did it in a summer, starting in about late May, ending in about August. They completed the writing of this document, and then it spent 1.5 years, to give you some more touch points for dates. They spent about 1.5 years trying to get the country to go, all right, we'll be governed by this. It's called the ratification period. It's the period of time when this was a draft proposal, and the country had to say, by state, yeah, we'll be governed by this. Took about 1.5 years. During that 1.5 year ratification period, there were a group of people who said, I love the Constitution. It's great. They're known as the Federalists. There's a group of people who wear black hats in this story called the Anti-Federalists who say, we should not pass this document. That, as you'll see, if you've never seen before, and we'll engage a little bit of that debate here in the weeks to follow, is the Federalist, anti-Federalist debate. The anti-Federalists do not want to ratify the Constitution, and they offer us arguments for why we shouldn't. These 85 essays are for the virtues of this document, and we'll look at the key ones here this semester in this regard. Okay, tell me what else you learned from reading this document. Obvious, big stuff. What'd you learn? Any, yeah?
How the government's set up.
How the government's set up?
Yeah.
Okay.
The balances of how, like, bills can be passed and laws can be.
Okay, so there is some detail, right? I mean, I can read about the process in which a bill becomes a law and who's got to sign this, that, and the other. So there is some specificity in there. What are the divisions of this document?
The different branches of government and their powers within it.
Okay.
So, kinds of powers they have.
All right, so there's some kind of subdivision where different departments of our government, our institutions, the legislative, judicial, executive branch, are addressed. Where is the legislative branch's powers addressed? I'm sorry?
Article 1.
Article 1. Good. We're making progress. All right? We're at the biggest picture right now. We'll look at details as we go forward this semester. Today, we're just looking at the big picture. Article 1 of the Constitution follows the preamble. The preamble is sort of here's the general purpose for the document. Now let's get to a little more detail. Article 1 deals with primarily the legislative branch and its powers. But the problem is, and this is just sort of a tip-off for where we're headed, the problem is, as I read Article 1, it mentions the president involved here. The president isn't the legislative body. Why would he be mentioned in Article 1? Just rhetorically asking that right now. Okay, what else we got? We got Article 2 here. And that addresses what? Biola University? What's going on with that?
The executive branch.
The executive branch is Article 2. So you're going to get real sophisticated in your communications over Easter. And you're going to be eating your Easter ham with Grandma, and you're going to say, "So Grandma, I understand that Barack Obama is the Article 2 officer of the Constitution." And you'll get pretty fancy, right? Article 2 defines the executive power, but you'll also note that the legislative branch is kind of mentioned in there a little bit. Uh-oh. Now we get Article 3, which deals with the judicial branch. Ah, all right. So we're making some progress. So now the three branches of our government are defined in Article 1, 2, and 3. Is Article 1 longer than Article 2? For good reason, you'll discover. Article 3 is real short, isn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, I could read that sort of about as long as it takes my son to finally get to the dinner table. I mean, that guy just takes forever. We're all sitting there like, oh, no. But I could read Article 3 pretty quick and probably get there before he finally gets there. And then you've got some other articles, which some of which remain pertinent. Some of them, sort of history has just kind of made them irrelevant now. And then you get a bunch of signatures after Article 8. That's the original Constitution. And then we've amended it 27 times. Any idea what it takes to amend the Constitution? Votes? Lots of them. Anybody want to add to that? Huh? Time? Yeah. Here's a great term. Arduous, long, suffering time. Yes.
I think it's over 67%.
Yeah, 2/3. If you want to amend this document, and it's been done 27 times, the original one ended right there after Article 7, and then a bunch of people signed it. That's the original Constitution. That's what emerged from Philadelphia in 1787. And then we've amended it 27 times. The first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights. See, yeah. Right? And there they are. And notice they're all in the same year. They were all passed in sort of one lump sum. And those are the Bill of Rights. We'll look at some of the key Bill of Rights this year, or this semester. And then it's been amended 17 more times, and here's what it takes to amend the Constitution. a proposal has to be offered in the Congress, at the National Congress there in DC. It has to pass both houses of our Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, with a 2/3 vote. Good luck with that, right? That's pretty tough to get 2/3 of those folks to agree on anything. Once that happens, then that offering goes to the states, and in the state legislatures, or if they call a state ratifying convention, most time it's just done at the state legislature. In those state legislatures, they have to pass it in 2/3 majorities too. In other words, you have to get a lot of people on board here to make significant changes to this. Yes?
Do you know roughly like how many proposals are made?
To a constitutional amendment? They come up every once in a while. In the later 90s into George Bush's presidency, there was a proposal to amend the Constitution to specifically define marriage heterosexually. And that comes up from time to time. There was a right to life amendment that was offered in the 1980s in the wake of Roe versus Wade, that many legislatures said we're going to specifically amend the Constitution to say that the developing fetus inside of a woman is a person and therefore subject to protection under the law. That didn't pass. How about this one, ladies? The ERA. That's not when you're playing baseball and you have an earned run average. What's the ERA, ladies? The Equal Rights Amendment. Failed. Miserable failure. Didn't pass. It's not in here. So that's another big notable one. They come up, so the answer is they come up from time to time. More than likely, in today's modern political world, this document is not amended via the amendment process. The Supreme Court will do it. And that says a lot about sort of modern times here. Take, for example, if women did not have the right to vote today, somebody would sue, wouldn't you? And some court, usually the U.S. Supreme Court in this case, would give women new rights to vote. In 1919, they went through the amendment process. They wouldn't do that today. Wouldn't do it. Okay. What else do I want to say about this? So anyway, that's sort of the detail here. Let me pull this up and see if we're addressing all the issues I wanted to address. Let's review. The Articles of Confederation. What kind of union did it set up? A loose association of states that were sovereign entities themselves, known as the Compact of States theory. What was the relationship of the states, the parts, to the whole? Very key to see this early on because we'll just sort of be referencing this throughout the semester. Yeah. In a sense, we really didn't even have a whole. That's a very key thing to see under the Articles of Confederation. The American Civil War is not an insignificant event, and it's largely fought over this. Slavery is obviously a key issue, but it's largely fought over the nature of the answer to this question. Do we have a genuine whole that's indivisible, or do we have a bunch of collection of parts? Southerners weighed in on that, right? And you know this because it's really interesting research project. We're going to do group research projects here, and nobody's ever done this, but I think it'd be a great research project to research the Confederacy and the Constitution of the Confederacy and compare it to our U.S. Constitution. That'd be a fascinating little research project because there'd be all kinds of Southern writing around it. You could sort of poke around in political history of sort of the alternate universe of the Confederacy. I mean, I was always fascinated by the Civil War, so. Okay, how was the government supposed to work under the Articles of Confederation? Sorry? So the national government of whatever there was sort of relied on the mutual cooperation of the states and did not possess independent power. in order for the government as a whole to act as a sort of national government, it required the cooperation, sometimes the unanimous cooperation of the states. That's why I told you about that deal in Syria. If you really want things to happen in the United Nations, you gotta get the right countries on board. And if even one of those countries wants to get in the way, nothing happens. So Syria today is still a violent bloodbath because of basically two countries that don't want to get in the way, or that do get in the way of this. So the government was supposed to work on mutual cooperation, and that didn't happen. Okay, Constitution. Why is it so short?
There's no way it covers them.
Okay, just, yeah, for time's sake, but it's so short because they didn't want to spend a year writing this thing. They only spent a summer for a more fundamental, substantive reason. Why do you think it's so short?
It's not laying out every single
Good.
law. It is just a structure of how
Good.
everything's going to work.
It's
Right,
a
type of
general,
framework.
this is a general framework for governance that in some cases is written in general, broad terms. This is a very different style of constitution that would not be written like that. It would be laying out a lot of detail. It's trying to take in more possible contingencies. This lays out a broad framework for how things go. But don't misunderstand that to mean that this means nothing. A lot of people say, oh, because it's written like that, Constitution can just mean whatever we want it to mean. Don't misunderstand it to mean that. It's just a different manner of approaching the task of governance, this versus that. You know what the Bill of Rights are and the other amendments. You will want to particularly pay careful note of the 14th Amendment. That's huge. The 14th Amendment after the Bill of Rights is probably the most significant amendment that's changed the constitutional order of the country. Big time. Big time. Okay. Let me do a quick check to see if we've covered everything I wanted to cover today. And then, oh, yes, there was a couple terms that I wanted to make sure you all were copacetic with. So let me raise this, turn this off, and jot a few terms down that you'll want to just, as you go forward reading now, you'll want to have down. Today, if I say, hey guys, where's the federal government? You'd say, Washington. How about if I said, hey, where's the national government? You'd think I'm asking you the same question. The term federal and national mean the same thing today, but as you read, they don't mean the same thing. So the term federal versus national are two different terms as you read, okay? A federal system is, as you read now, early in these types of writings, and they talk about a federal system, what they're talking about is a kind of governmental system in which you have a national government, but it's decentralized in that you also have state and local governments. That's a federal system. A national system is where you just have one government from on high that governs the whole thing. Today, we use these terms interchangeably. Why? Because the national government has gotten so big that we almost equate it with the federal government right now. Okay, so let me say that one more time because I can tell a few of you are like, what? As you start reading early in the semester, you're going to encounter that term. When you encounter that term, that's a part whole thing. That's a governmental system in which you have some form of a whole country that's governed in a kind of decentralized kind of way that possesses a national government, but also pieces like state and local governments too. That's a federal system. If you were to be in another country, let me think of one that has a national system, sort of like France. France doesn't have states. That's more of a what's called a unitary government, a single governmental entity that governs over the whole thing. That's more what you think to be a national government. What else? There is a difference when you see that word with a capital C, it refers to this here document. If you see with a small c, it's referring to some kind of principle of some sort, constitutional. It's with a small c. So if you see it with a capital C, it's referring to a real life document. A small c isn't referring to the document, it's referring to sort of a manner of governance, that we're governed as a constitutional order, that kind of thing. So keep that one in mind too. Okay. Now the only thing we didn't talk about was Federalist Chapter 1, and there was just a couple things that I wanted to make sure you understood about that. It's the announcement of a certain project here. The project here is to present 85 essays speaking to the virtues of why we ought to ratify the Constitution. At the end of the Federalist 1, he gives you a laundry list. If I successfully convert you to a political science major, you'll know much more about this book by the time you graduate from Biola. But essentially all I wanted you to read Federalist 1 once is to give you an overall sense of the announcement of a project, to convince you of the virtues of the Constitution, that you should vote yes on this thing when we bring it up to a vote by 1789. That's what this was, for a variety of reasons, one of which is that we're going to create a union that's going to work now, whereas before we didn't. And we're going to have a government that's real and independent, that can operate like a national government. Before we did this United Nations kind of thing. So that's why I had you read this. And they actually thought that they were doing something novel. So there's, here on the first page of Federalist 1, John Jay argues this: the whole world's watching to see whether this is going to be a success or not. Something unique about our founding generation is they saw themselves as a unique experiment that the world would watch to see whether it would work. It's called the American experiment in democracy. And they saw what they were doing as an experiment. And the initial lab results for the first 7 years were miserable, utter failure. And now they were tweaking it a lot to see if we could govern ourselves better. And hey, you know, for all the wrinkles and warts that we've had over the last 200 some odd years, this has actually worked pretty well, hasn't it? I mean, it's lasted more than 7 years like the first one did. So what we'll do this semester is to help you become acquainted with the major issues that we've had to wrestle with throughout our country's history, and you'll see that many of them are the same that we have now.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.